So thrilled to be with you this evening and to have you all out here. Thank you for spending a little bit of your evening here tonight. It doesn't take much to persuade me to come back to Milwaukee. I'm so thrilled to be here. I have an unreasonable and categorical love of Milwaukee. I'm so glad to be here. So our first year of marriage, my husband and I, was spent here. We lived right across from Metro Market downtown, across from, what was it called? We were on Senate and Juneau Village Towers there, and he had just graduated from law school, and I had just graduated from my master's in the UK, and we spent the month of July, or the month of July, he was sitting for the bar, and I was writing my dissertation. We go to Vancouver, Canada, to get married, and then we start our life here in Milwaukee together after having a long-distance relationship of almost 2 years. And so it was like a year-long honeymoon for us here. We love Milwaukee, had a wonderful community. It was such a place of community and of hospitality, and we're just forever grateful for the kindness that you showed us here. And I'll share with you a story that is so emblematic of our time here and why we loved it so much. So we were moving all of my husband's personal effects from Indiana, where he lives, to here in Milwaukee, where we were living. And for some reason, both sets of his grandparents decided to help us move here to Milwaukee. So imagine the scenario: there's 2 caravans of me and my husband, and then 3 septuagenarians moving all of his stuff from Indiana to Milwaukee. And we call our rental apartment building, say, okay, we're just a few hours away. We're set to, move in today, sign the lease, give you a deposit, get our keys. And they said, okay, great. You just have to be here in the next hour. Otherwise, you'll get your keys on Monday. This is like a Saturday. And we're like, well, that won't do. That's not an option. And so we said, what can we do? Who can we call? And we know no one here. And thankfully, just a few weeks prior, a former professor of mine had put me in touch with one of his classmates from Yale, where he had done grad school. And this was Chris Gansky. I don't know if he's in the audience, but I know his wife Kate is here. Kate, I'm so thrilled that you're here. And so this is one of a handful of people that we knew and had met, and we had stayed with them when we were apartment hunting, coming to Milwaukee before moving here. And we call the handful of people that we do know. No one can help us. They're out of town, they're unable to, but Chris, without question, rises to the occasion, goes to our apartment building, pays our deposit, gets our keys, and then we're able to move in that night and have the weekend settling in and acclimating to the city as we intended. And Chris is actually a pastor of City Reformed Church in Milwaukee, right downtown. And I remember, we picked up the keys from Chris, thanked him, paid him back the security deposit, and I think we looked at each other and we said, I think we know we're going to church this year. We didn't really have a choice at that point. We had a wonderful church community. That was one reason why we loved Milwaukee so much, and just so many wonderful friends that we're still in close touch with. I'm really glad to have Boswell Books here, for example. They hosted a lovely book event for me right after my book came out. Maybe some of you were at that event. So please do consider supporting a local bookstore that is a dying breed, as we all know, and purchase a copy and pay them a visit downtown when and if you can. But yes, just thank you for having me. Thank you to Doug. Thank you to Linda. So grateful for the excuse to be back here in Milwaukee. So my book is about the most important question of our day. How do we flourish across deep difference? And what does that look like in practice, even in our own deeply divided moment? I came to my interest in this topic honestly. My mother, I'm not even joking, she's called Judy the Manners Lady. And I was raised in a home by a woman who's just extraordinary in so many ways. My childhood she's kind of a combination of Maria von Trapp in The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. Just everything's a game, everything's a song. She's just the most joy-filled, ebullient personality you'll ever encounter in your life. She's someone who sits with a stranger on a 30-minute plane ride and leaves with a best friend and will share a car ride home with them. And she literally embodies her life according to the ethos that a stranger is just a friend that you haven't met yet. Our home growing up was a revolving door of strangers, of newcomers to our community. We must have had homestays from a dozen different countries, from people around the world, students who lived with us. And she was just always eager to transform outsider to insider, stranger into the friend. And she's zealous about the human social project and passionate about manners and social norms to the extent that they facilitate this project of living well with others, this project that really is the stuff of the good life, but it's also really hard, and we'll talk about the timelessness of this problem tonight throughout this talk. So my mother, I remember growing up, she would teach my brothers and I, not only did she model civility and hospitality for us, but she taught us, to mind our P's and Q's and the ways and means of social proprieties. And I remember always questioning them. She would teach us how to set the table just so, how to cut our food, how to shake hands and look people in the eye. And this won't surprise people who know me, but I am constitutionally allergic to authority. I hate rules. I hate being told what to do. I was joking to Linda, I almost get arrested every time I walk through TSA because it's like I hate arbitrary exertion of authority and power. It's like I want to know why, And this goes back to childhood where my mother would, tell us to do things a certain way, and I wanted to know why. Why do we set the table this way? Why do we use forks and knives at all? Why do we, some cultures eat with their hands, others with chopsticks. Why do we greet the way we do? We greet with a handshake, others with a bow. And I hungered for the origin and the purpose and meaning behind these social norms and expectations that we were expected to comply with. And my mother's explanations never satisfied me. They were often along the lines of, this is just the way we do it, and do it. and so that never quite satisfied me, and so these questions have lingered with me my entire life. And, but I generally did follow them because my mom promised that they would lead to success in work, in school, and life. And she was right, until I found myself at the United States Department of Education. I served in federal government 2017 to 2018. It was actually right after our season here in Milwaukee. We were in Milwaukee 2015, 2016, and I worked at a local think tank here in Milwaukee. My husband clerked for a federal judge, and we were only ever planning to be here in Milwaukee 1 year. And after our roles ended, we picked up and moved to Washington. My husband started a big law firm there, and the world in fall of 2016 felt like my oyster. I felt like I could do anything. And being offered a role in federal government felt like a big career break. I was just out of grad school, where I focused on education policy, and I just worked in education policy at the local level here in Milwaukee, and it felt like a chance to contribute, to serve the country, to make our educational system a little bit better for America's students. And I could not have been more disillusioned or discouraged by my experience in government, that 1 year service. I was surrounded by these two extremes when I was in government. On one hand, there was a contingent that was overtly hostile. They were bellicose. They were bullies. These are the people that I knew to stay away from early on. These are the people who, were willing to step on anyone to get ahead. Anyone between them and their objectives, crush them out of the way. Then there was this other contingent, though, and this other contingent, I at first thought, is the people who knew the rules. They were polished and poised and polite. But these are the people who would smile at me and others one moment, and then stab us in the back the next. And this second contingent deeply perplexed me. It scared me. One thing my mother had said to me growing up was that manners mattered because they were outward expressions of our inward character. And yet here I was surrounded by a contingent of people who were well-mannered enough, and yet ruthless and cruel. I remember one time, I was in my little cubicle minding my own business when I was in government, and a colleague approached me and he said, "Oh, Lexi, you look radiant today, and by the way, you're so brilliant, and by the way, I need your help." I said, okay, what do you need your help? What do you need help with? Happy to lend a hand. He goes, I'm just overwhelmed. I'm slammed. I'm behind. Do you mind helping me finish this memo? It would mean a lot. I'd really appreciate it. I said, sure, no problem. I didn't realize that he expected me to do the entire project for him. But I did. I was happy to help. And then he takes my work, passes it off as his own, and then and takes all the credit associated with it, and then gone after that with the pleasantries, the compliments, the niceties, the obsequiousness that he had used to butter me up to get my help, only to cast me aside when he no longer needed me. I felt mad and so used. And of course, I didn't feel like I'd want to help him again if he ever needed the help again. I mean, it felt really short-sighted. We're colleagues, like we're gonna have to coexist and do things together in the future. And that's when I realized, upon reflection, that these two extremes, they seem like polar opposites. The extreme hostility and bellicosity on one hand, and extreme politeness on the other. They seem like polar opposites, but they're actually very similar. Both have an insufficiently high view of the dignity and beauty of the human person, and both instead see others as means to their selfish ends. That's what my colleague had seen me as in that moment. He didn't see me as an end in myself. He saw me as an instrument to help him get his project done. And I realized that both those modes, while they seem like polar opposites, they share that fundamental instrumentalization of others, that the hostile contingent sees others as pawns to be silenced and steamrolled in order to get what they want. And the polite contingent sees others as pawns to be manipulated, flattered in order to get what they want. But both have an insufficiently high view of the dignity of the human person. And that's why my book is in many ways a humanistic manifesto, extolling the gifts of being human, the dignity and beauty of personhood in all of its forms, especially when it comes to those that we disagree with and may not like. My time in government service also clarified for me a theme that is throughout my book, that there is an essential distinction between civility and politeness. I saw the uses and abuses of politeness rampant, and that didn't sit well with me. It perplexed me, and I realized that, just having the form and style of polish, that was not enough, actually. And I think a lot of people miss this important distinction today. There are two really prominent voices in our public discourse. There's one contingent that says, we're so divided, we're defined by partisanship, and we just need to revive civility and politeness. Often they harken back to a bygone era, a golden age of chivalry and gentility and comedy. And they say, if we could just get back to that golden age and revive civility and politeness, that's what we need to resolve our deep differences today. So they want more civility and politeness. There's another contingent that says quite the opposite. They say no. They say civility and politeness are part of the problem. They're the tools of the powerful, the patriarchy, the white supremacists. They're tools to keep the powerless silent and powerless and to oppress. We need less civility and politeness in order to pursue greater justice and equity in our world today. What both these voices in public life today miss is this essential foundational distinction between civility and politeness. I argue that politeness is manners, it's etiquette, it's technique, it's external stuff, it's the things that we do and say. Whereas civility is internal. It's not just the technique of politeness, it's an inner disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals who are worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community, by virtue of the Imago Dei, by virtue of our shared humanity. And that's crucially, sometimes actually respecting someone, actually loving someone, requires being impolite. It requires telling a hard truth, engaging a robust debate. Civility says, I respect you enough to take your ideas seriously and tell you when I disagree with you. I'm not going to patronize you and tell you that there's no difference here when there is an important difference. It means respecting ourselves enough to broach uncomfortable conversations with others that might need to be had. I love etymology, the stories behind our language and our words, and often and other languages as well, is often so illuminating. And though this distinction between civility and politeness is often missed today, it actually honors the etymology of these two words, civility and politeness. The Latin root of politeness is polliere, which means to smooth or to polish. And that's what politeness does. It's external. It's superficial. It polishes over difference. It sweeps it under the rug, as opposed to giving us the tools to grapple with difference head on. The etymology of civility. Anyone know? Anyone have a classics or Latin background here? Feel free to. What is it? The Latin root of civility is civitas, which is the etymological root of our words citizenship, city, of course, civilization, and this is what civility is. It's the conduct, the mores, the character befitting a citizen in the city, and especially in a democracy like our own, that requires truth-telling, that demands spirited, robust debate, that demands bringing our deeply held values and beliefs and opinions to the fore and having a place to hash them out as we collectively pursue the good and the true together. That is foundational to the idea of our democracy. And I argue throughout the book that we need, too often today, we are fixated on politeness, and we're too satisfied when people do and say the right things, and we should instead be focused on civility. Are we doing the right things for the right reasons, and are we willing to actually offend and maybe hurt people's feelings in order to actually respect them, and not just settling for the appearance of respecting others, but instead pursuing true respect and true civility. As I mentioned, this is the most important question of our day. How do we flourish across deep difference? Many of you in this room are in the realm of civics and histories. You're history professors, you're teachers, you're in the classroom. And this is a high watermark for democracy this year. Half the globe is going to the polls to vote, which is a victory for democracies. And yet, we're experiencing unprecedented threats to democracy simultaneously, hyper-partisanship, threats of political violence, growing extremism. These are facing democracies around the world, including our own. I've been in 45 cities on book tour since my book came out in October of last year. I've been in 5 countries, and I've spoken and I've visited democracies around the world, and this is causing anxiety, this is causing concern for citizens and public leaders everywhere. Consternation about this challenge of how to do life together across deep difference. So this is the most important question of our era. But it's not a new question. It's not a new challenge. It's in fact a timeless one. As long as we have been around as a species, we have been trying to do this thing called life together with others. And as long as we've been around as a species, it has been hard. We've been doing it imperfectly. There's this duality in our nature. We are profoundly social as a species. We are doggedly social. In all times and all places, people have come together in community, in groups, in order to increase their chances of survival, to live in collaboration and cooperation, but also to flourish. Life together is the good life. It is the best life. Life in community, life in friendship is where we realize our full humanity, our full potential. The Greek word for person is proposon, which means he who stands in the eyes of someone else. So we become fully human, full people, only in relationship to others. So on one hand, we're profoundly social, and yet, morally and biologically, we are defined by self-love. We are driven innately to meet our own needs before others. And these two facets of who we are, the love of others and the love of self, are intention. They always have been, they always will be. And that is why this is just as much a challenge, a problem today as it was at the dawn of our species. And I'll tell you a story that illustrates this so well. Anyone here read Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Raise your hands. Just a handful of you. It's a classic. Go do revisit it. It's such a powerful metaphor of this duality in the human condition that is to the cause of the timelessness of this problem. So Dr. Jekyll is a prestigious, illustrious physician in Scotland, universally adored and respected. And yet, he struggles with these baser urges, these impulses that he can't quite shake. And he devises a plan that he thinks solves this problem. He is in his laboratory in his basement. He concocts this potion that he drinks at night and allows him to transform into the barbaric, deformed, monstrous, and abominably cruel Mr. Hyde, who goes out at night and acts out Dr. Jekyll's base lusts and desires. He hurts people, he just causes havoc on society, and he's able to do so anonymously. He's able to do so without risk to his reputation and his status. And so he thinks he's got the situation under control for a little bit, but then something strange begins to happen. Dr. Jekyll begins to realize that the more he drinks the potion, the less he needs the potion to transform into the barbaric and monstrous Mr. Hyde. And eventually, he begins to transform into Mr. Hyde spontaneously, eventually, even permanently, becoming Mr. Hyde, who eventually kills and overtakes Dr. Jekyll permanently. And in the note that he leaves when people find Jekyll dead, he says, it cannot be said that I was either purely Jekyll or purely Hyde, either friend or foe. I was irrevocably both. There is this duality in our nature within every single one of us. It's easy to externalize the challenges to flourishing across difference today. Social media, different political leaders, this party or that party, but this issue actually emerges from a part of the human personality that we all share. One of my favorite thinkers and philosophers and theologian is a gentleman named St. Augustine. He was from North Africa, what is modern-day Algeria. And in his book, famous work called City of God, he was reflecting on the fall of the Roman Empire in this book. And he unpacks this concept. One reason he claims Rome fell is because it was defined, the entire empire and the population was defined by what he called the libido dominandi. And the libido dominandi was this lust to dominate. And Augustine was really clever. That was this phrase, libido dominandi, is wordplay in the original Latin, because what Augustine realized was that the more people exercised and acted out their lust to dominate others and monomaniacally pursue their self-interest above others, that became the dominating lust, the lust that dominated them. And that's exactly what we saw happen to Dr. Jekyll, who one too many times acted out his baser impulses in the form of Mr. Hyde, and eventually let those impulses permanently overtake him. So timeless problem, But the solution, thankfully, is also timeless. Part of my life's work and project in this book, but just life in general, is to revive unsung heroes in history of civility and of just champions of the humanistic values that are so important to me and to our moment. And I love particularly insights from one of history's greatest teachers. His name is Erasmus of Rotterdam. Raise your hands. Anyone in this room heard of Erasmus of Rotterdam? Handful of people. Well, I hope that all of you leave tonight partisans of Erasmus, and help me spread the good word of Erasmus of Rotterdam after tonight. So Erasmus he's relatively obscure and unknown today, but he was the intellectual superstar of the European Renaissance. He was born out of wedlock, which in that day was quite a scandal, and so he left his hometown of Rotterdam in the Netherlands very early in life, never to return. And he led a sort of peripatetic life as a traveling scholar and teacher, and he was the most coveted dinner guest in all of Europe. He would go from kingdom to kingdom, court to court, and he would just live for a few years here and there, educating princes and princesses. And he was just jovial and fun and witty and smart, friend of Thomas More's. And he's kind of forgotten to history because he's this unsung hero of moderation. We live in a very tribal, a very partisan era today. Erasmus lived in a similarly divided era. Today, our divisions center largely around politics. The divisions in Erasmus's day were largely around religion. So Erasmus was a member of the Catholic Church, but he wasn't a monolithic partisan of the Catholic Church. He saw a lot of things in the church that he thought were really ugly, really wrong, really immoral. It was, whether it was the uses of indulgences, the abuses of power of priests, and priests who had kids out of wedlock, and they're supposed to be celibate, just all these different things. And so Erasmus embodied civility in this way. He loved the Catholic Church enough to criticize it, to call it out to a higher standard of conduct, and call it out where it was falling short. And these criticisms that Erasmus promulgated were very influential on someone who's better known to history, one Martin Luther. It's said by historians and scholars that Erasmus laid the egg of the Reformation that Luther later hatched. And they were originally friends, close friends, and Erasmus was very influential on Luther. But Erasmus loved the church enough to criticize it, and also loved and respected enough not to break ties with it entirely, as Luther and many others did as part of the Protestant Reformation. And so as a result, that left him in this sort of religious gray area where he was a black sheep in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church did not like being criticized by Erasmus, but also he wasn't a Protestant, so he's not claimed to this day by either party. Again, he's kind of forgotten to history and known primarily in kind of secular circles for his translation of the Greek New Testament, just like a kind of a very scholarly endeavor. So Erasmus, unsung hero of moderation and civility in history, universally adored. Even though he championed these great scholarly feats, he cared deeply about manners. The story is that one day he was walking in the street and he thought that a youth paid him insufficient deference. Talk about the timelessness of the complaint about kids these days. And so fed up with the lack of manners in youths, he set pen to paper and he wrote this little treatise. You can go on Amazon or find it on Gutenberg Press right now. It's called A Handbook on Civility in Children. And I read hundreds, if not thousands, of these treatises and texts and ethical manuals on conduct and manners from across history and across culture while writing my book, and explore that in chapter 2 of my book on the timelessness of the solution and the timelessness of civility. And Erasmus is the only book that I'm aware of that categorizes its maxims of do's and don'ts according to body part. So for example, Erasmus has a whole chapter, a section on the eyes. He says, he's categorically, for example, against winking. He says, never wink, just don't do it. That is the stuff of mythical animals and tuna fish, so don't wink, according to Erasmus. I love he was presciently sanitary. This is before germ theory, but Erasmus in the 1500s, he has this maxim on the chapter on the hands. He says, wash your hands before dinner, and as you wash your hands, shut your eyes, and so too cleanse, like as the water is running dirt off your hands, so too cleanse your mind of the pollutants of the day. And don't let those pollutants, either from your hands or your mind, burden your ability to engage with those you're about to share a meal with, which I think is just such a beautiful metaphor and so wonderful, so beautiful. I think that Erasmus's last maxim, his last instruction and mandate, the final one in his book, really encapsulates the timelessness of true civility. He ends his book saying, readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself. I'll say that one more time. Readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself. And I love that because it's so countercultural to the ethos of our moment. Everything around us wants to externalize and blame others. You know, it's not our fault, it's them, it's the other side, it's the person we don't like that we disagree with. And Erasmus says, no. Like, you can't control others, focus on yourself. Ignore, show grace, dispense grace and forgiveness readily. And focus on what you can control, which is yourself. So, and in the chapter 2 of my book, I go through Erasmus and other ancient manuals from the oldest book in the world, from ancient Egypt, which is also a civility book, to manuals in ancient Greece and Sanskrit texts, to show that there really is this core body of human wisdom about how to do life together across deep difference. And it's really encapsulated in this idea of civility. And civility is the art of human flourishing. It is the bare minimum of respect that we are owed and owe to others by virtue of our shared humanity. It is respecting people enough to be impolite and tell hard truths. It's more than just politeness. But respecting ourselves and others enough to bring our deeply held values and ideas to the fore and have those conversations. And people across time and place have independently come to remarkably similar ideas about this conception of civility and why it is so indispensable to how to flourish today. I think that's so fascinating to kind of zoom out and get a global historical perspective to this problem that causes a lot of anxiety now. But we're not the first and only people to have grappled with this. And we can really benefit by reviving this timeless wisdom to help us do life better together now. It can feel really frustrating to me as a student of history, as it is to, I'm sure, many of you as students and teachers of history, to see how history has become an unfortunate forefront of the division in our world right now, and a forefront of the cultural war even. There's the 1619 project, and there's a 1776 project, and it's like, it just feels frustrating and vexing, but I think we can all agree that there are heroes, there are villains of history to be sure, there are heroes of history that I think we can all learn from and get behind. And a core project of my book, like I did with Erasmus and others, is to revive these unsung heroes, these underknown heroes of history, these forgotten heroes that can instruct us in civility and how to flourish across deep difference today. And one of these thinkers, and one of these figures that I'd love to introduce you to is a gentleman named Edward Coles. So I know many of you in this room are history teachers, so raise your hand if any of you have heard of Edward Coles before. Anyone here? Okay. You seem to know a lot of these people. I like you. So Edward Coles, he was a generation after the founding fathers. And he was an aide to James Madison in the White House and a neighbor to Thomas Jefferson. And he was, importantly, of the same social class and strata as the founding fathers, a kind of landed aristocratic gentry in Virginia. And his story really powerfully illustrates the duty that we sometimes have as citizens to embody civility, to speak out against injustice, to even speak truth, to power even when it might be costly and dangerous to us. And Edward Coles is such a great example of this idea that you won't find him in any textbooks. He's relatively forgotten in American history, but he shouldn't be. So when Edward Coles was an aide, a lowly aide, oh, sorry, I'll back up for a second. So Coles, somehow earlier in his life, he had become persuaded of the moral abhorrence of slavery. He was just absolutely persuaded by that and wanted to dedicate his life to abolition. He was really savvy, though. He was quiet about his abolitionist sentiments until his father died and left him, Coles, his slaves. And Coles immediately manumitted his slaves and moved to Illinois, and eventually, which was not a slave state, and eventually ran and won, became governor of Illinois on an abolitionist platform. It was an inspiration to Abraham Lincoln, in fact, which I'll return to in a second. But anyway, earlier in his life, Coles was a lowly aide to James Madison in the White House. So imagine, just like, I have a lot of empathy, like career break of a lifetime, and to have this great proximity to power, this great experience, and he decides to do something kind of extraordinary. He decides to write a letter to his neighbor, Thomas Jefferson, imploring Jefferson to join the abolitionist movement and cause. And this is virtually one of the only examples or instances in history where we have Jefferson overtly confronted with this core hypocrisy of his life. Here he was, the architect of liberty, while simultaneously owning other human beings. He had drafted these words of the Declaration of Independence, of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all, while at the same time subjugating and having ownership over other human beings. So Coles writes a letter to Jefferson. He says, you are the most respected elder statesman of our day. When you speak, when you write, people listen. It would mean an enormous amount if you picked up your pen and lent your voice and your reputation and your credence to the abolitionist cause. Would you consider doing that? And imagine, he's like a quasi-intern writing the most powerful statesman in the country. I mean, Jefferson, with one stroke of the pen, could have ended his career. I just kind of imagine Coles kind of shaking his boots, but feeling a moral compulsion to speak out and ask for help, just to at least know that he tried everything he could. Amazingly, Jefferson writes back. Jefferson says, "Edward, great to hear from you. Thanks for your note. I appreciate you taking the time to write. And I hear what you're saying," Jefferson says. "You're right. Of course slavery is going to be abolished at some point. Of course this is the right thing to do. I mean," he says, "just look at the Haitian Revolution, which had been a slave revolt against colonial powers." He's like, look, this is the trend in history. This is where history is going. Obviously this is the right thing that's going to happen, but this just isn't my fight, Jefferson says. This is a fight for younger men. So, thoughts and prayers, all best wishes, TJ. And Edward Coles writes back and says, Jefferson had 5, 6 excuses, and just piece by piece dismantles every single one of them. For example, in the excuse that Thomas Jefferson offered that he was too old, Coles says, your fellow founding father, Benjamin Franklin, he has changed his mind. He's joined our abolitionist cause, and He's no spring chicken. And just like excuse after excuse, he just, meets Jefferson and offers a counter argument and basically saying, thoughts and prayers is really not enough. And Jefferson never responded after that. But we do. You can go on Wikipedia, go on these archives. You can read that their whole correspondence, which is worth reading in its entirety. And I just love the way that this story has several insights and several lessons for us today. One, we hear a lot of people today that they want to excuse the past. They say, injustices happen, sure, but don't judge people of the past by the standards of the present. We're more evolved, we're more enlightened and educated now. It's wrong of us to hold the past to our present standards, our more elevated and evolved standards. But I love stories like Holz's because they show that there were people of the founding era, but of other eras too. There are many citizens of humanity who saw the injustices of their day, and they acted in ways that were highly risky to their own livelihoods, their own self-interest, in order to speak truth to power, in order to promote greater justice in our world and speak out against injustice where they saw it. And that doesn't exonerate. I just don't buy that argument. Don't judge the past by the standards of the present, when there were people of those eras who saw the moral abhorrence of slavery and other injustices and took a stand for it. And Cole's, secondly, is also a powerful example of the duty of true civility, to sometimes speak up even when it's costly to us and risky to us, for the sake of a higher good, for the sake of respecting personhood and human dignity. Even though stories like those of Edward Cole's are inspiring and encouraging in equal measure, it can still feel very overwhelming and helpless. Like, what can we do, we here in this room, to be a part of the solution? We're constantly inundated by these challenges, and the culture wars are everywhere, and we just feel like we're one people, one person. What can we do? And I realized, I came to discover firsthand when I moved from Washington, D.C. to Indianapolis, that we have way more power to be a part of the solution than we realize. Every single one. So I served for a year in government in Washington, D.C. Again, that was my year right after we left here in Milwaukee. And I hated it. And I remember one day I got just so particularly vexed and frustrated. I came home to my husband and said, I am done with DC. I'm done with Washington. I'm done with politics. Let's move to Indiana. I said, this is my great idea. And he said, so we'll move to Indiana. This is where he's from originally. And I largely had in my mind the kind of tranquility and community and rootedness that we had experienced here in Milwaukee. And we had talked about moving back to the Midwest at some point. And so he said, okay, sounds good. We'll move to Indiana. No take-backs. And a few months later, we were out there. That was 6 years ago. And it was 9 years ago that we were here in Milwaukee. It does not feel like that long ago. So we moved to Indianapolis a few months later. And one of my first friends, when we moved back to the Midwest, her name was Joanna Taft. And she came up to me after church one day and said, hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime? And I had never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but I was curious. And we didn't have any friends in town. So we went to her home that afternoon. She had this great big historic home with a great big front veranda. And I realized that on her front porch that day, Joanna was staging a quiet revolution against our atomized and divided status quo. She had curated people on our porch that day across politics, class, geography, race, not to have structured conversation across difference, but to just be in the same vicinity, to just be people, be citizens, and to remind us that we have way more in common than what differentiates us. When the world wants us to assign ultimate meaning and value to one aspect of who we are, Joanna's porch reminded us that we have in common that which matters most, which is our shared moral status as human beings and as citizens. And we do have way more in common than which differentiates us. And over the course of writing this book, I realized that Joanna, and there were many others like her, staging similar subversive, quiet revolutions against our atomized, divided, alienated, and broken status quo. These are people who are saying, I cannot control what's going to happen in the next presidential election cycle. I can't control who's in the White House. I can't control what's happening, what injustices are happening across the world. But I can control myself. And I am going to choose to make my community more beautiful, my family better and stronger from right where I am. And that's exactly what Joanna's doing with her front porch. And I came to realize the porch is really just a metaphor for this lifestyle of doing just what I saw my mother had done for countless people growing up, transforming outsider to insider, stranger into friend. And over the course of this book tour and of writing this book, I saw people, porching from their front dock, from their front lawn, from their dining room. Some people don't have a porch, they hold office hours at a coffee shop. But it's not about what you have, it's about how you use what you do have. And it's about a lifestyle of civility. And I realized that the more people that choose to reclaim, and we can each do the same. It's not about what we have, that we can each do the same too. And I realized that the more people who choose to reclaim the soul of civility in our everyday, in the small ways, that we might be able to change the world. So thank you so much for having me back here in Milwaukee. Thanks again to Linda and Doug, and thanks to each of you for spending a little bit of your evening here tonight.